So the documentary is sort of the culmination of a research project I undertook for my master's, and what that was exploring was masculinity and fatherhood. And the reason that I wanted to look at these topics was because I grew up having never met my own father, and obviously that raised a bunch of questions that I'd sort of wanted to explore. I suppose for my own personal growth. So that prompted me on this whole sort of research project where I went around the country talking to various people who had interesting perspectives on these topics. And in the process of doing that, I was keeping my eye out for I guess, a vehicle to sort of compile the research that I was doing into a documentary. And one of the people I met while I was doing these interviews was the then CEO, now state manager of the Fathering Project, Wayne Bradshaw, who told me a little bit about the Fathering Project and what they were looking to do in Armidale. So uh, as soon as he sort of told me about that, I knew that this was going to be the perfect vehicle to sort of consolidate the research I'd been doing into a documentary. So when I was making the film, it definitely opened up a rabbit hole in terms of exploring the topics of fatherhood and masculinity. Um, these were both topics I hadn't particularly considered in too much depth beforehand. And certainly it took me down this rabbit hole, and I was able to understand a lot of different elements and aspects of these two topics. I think what surprised me the most was that uh, in Australia, we sort of have this narrative around masculinity and fatherhood um, centered around this idea of toxic masculinity. And when I started to sort of break that down and look at what the narratives were that sort of inform that in our culture, it sort of seemed to be pinned around this idea that men lack the ability to share and communicate, uh, particularly around their emotional life. So I wanted to challenge that narrative, and I started to uh, interview a whole bunch of people around the country and start to put that narrative to the test. And what I found was that men actually are not only willing but desperate to kind of share their inner life with other people. And I didn't find much of a problem at all in terms of men being willing to talk about their emotions and their feelings. So I started to consider that perhaps there was a bit more to the story, and it became more and more um, obvious to me that it was more so about men having safe spaces in which to share their emotional side. Community spaces where they can feel safe to talk about what's going on in their life, where they feel a sense of belonging. And that's why I thought the Fathering Project was so unique, because they were actually focused on creating those spaces for men. So I guess what really surprised me about masculinity and fatherhood was that the prevalent narrative that we have today in our culture about men probably needs to be broadened a little bit.
Solution.
I think good fathering is essential to any child's life. Growing up fatherless myself, I know what it means to be lacking that, be lacking positive male role models in your life. And I've also seen through this project how powerful it is to have a dad that's really engaged with his kids' lives, with his kids' life, how much of a positive impact that can make on a child. So I think it's absolutely important. And I really think that we, as a society, need to acknowledge that and put more focus on enabling fathers to do their jobs in better ways.
Solution.
I think there were two pretty powerful and confronting emotional moments that I faced in the making of this film. The first was on the very first day of filming. I met the protagonist of the film, Travis, and he took me out onto the streets of Armidale. And he basically just started going up to men on the street and asking them what their story was around fathering. And the stories that we heard were so harrowing. It really, really touched me and moved me and gave me the sense that this story is so important, and it's an issue that really needs to have some light shone on it. We had a young Indigenous man come up to us and basically break down crying because he'd lost access to his young son. He obviously lacked, the skills to be an effective father, but it didn't mean that he didn't have love or the desire to want to be a part of his son's life. So there was definitely a chasm there in terms of, men and their ability to father with their desire to father. The other confronting emotional aspect of this project for me was reaching out to my own father, who I'd never met or spoken to. And in the film, that story kind of plays out. And obviously, it was very difficult. It was something I was very resistant to including into the film. But the feedback I got was that it made it so much more identifiable for the audience. So I thought for that respect, if it was a part of the film that could help viewers connect with it, then I was willing to sort of share that, even though it required me to be quite vulnerable